The blood hit the floor before anyone moved. It wasn't a slow spread, it was a torrent, dark and arterial, pooling beneath the gurney while the monitors screamed and the trauma team stood frozen around a surgeon who had just made the worst cut of his career. Dr. Marcus Holt's hands were still inside the patient's chest when the pressure dropped to nothing. 42/20, then 30. Then the alarm changed pitch entirely, and everyone in Trauma Bay 1 understood that the man on the table was dying faster than he had been 30 seconds ago. Pressure's tanking. I see it. Doctor, his abdomen. I said I see it. But he didn't. That was the problem. The surgeon standing at the center of that room, the one whose name appeared on 3 published studies and whose photograph hung in the hospital's main corridor, had missed it completely. The nurse beside him had spotted it 12 minutes earlier. She had said so. Quietly, carefully, with the exact clinical language that should have stopped everything. He had told her to check the supply card and stay out of it. Her name was Lena Vasquez. She was 32 years old, a night shift ER nurse at Harlow General Hospital in the city of Denton Falls. And in approximately 4 seconds, she was going to push a decorated surgeon aside and do something that would change both their lives permanently. She wasn't thinking about that yet. She was thinking about the artery. If this story already has you gripping your seat, stick with me until the very end, because what happens next is going to shake you. Hit follow so you don't miss a single part, and drop a like if you're already feeling it. And leave me a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The call came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Lena Vasquez heard it the same way she heard everything on the night shift, through the radio clipped to the nurse's station desk, half buried under a stack of intake forms and 2 empty coffee cups that no one had thrown away yet. GSW, male, approximate age 40, vitals deteriorating en route, ETA 4 minutes. She was already moving before the dispatcher finished the sentence. Harlow General Hospital sat on the eastern edge of Denton Falls, a mid-sized city in a state where the winters ran long and the hospital budgets ran short. The building was old enough to have original tile in the corridors and new enough to have a trauma wing that functioned most nights with reasonable efficiency. Most nights. The night shift ran leaner than the day crew, and by midnight the ER operated with a skeleton team that knew each other's rhythms well enough to work without talking much. Lena had been on nights for 3 years. She'd requested it. The pace suited something in her that she didn't bother explaining to people who asked. She pulled a fresh trauma kit from the supply shelf, checked the IV lines on the nearest bay, and did a quick inventory of the resuscitation cart by touch. She could do it without looking, had done it hundreds of times, while the charge nurse, a wiry man named Pete Garland, moved to her left and began prepping the second gurney as backup. "Brixton's on tonight," Pete said, not looking up. Lena didn't answer. Pete glanced at her. "Holt's covering trauma." "I know. Just saying. I heard you." She wasn't being cold. It was just that there wasn't anything useful to add. Dr. Marcus Holt was the attending trauma surgeon for the evening shift, a man with 15 years of surgical experience, a reputation for precision, and a particular way of entering a trauma bay that seemed to compress the space around everyone else. He was good at his job. He was also the kind of good that knew it, wore it, and sometimes let it make him careless in ways that were easy to miss if you weren't watching closely. Lena watched closely. It was one of the things she did. The ambulance bay doors opened at 11:51. The paramedics came through fast, one of them calling out the stats in a clipped, practiced cadence, while the other kept pressure on the patient's left side. Marcus Webb, no confirmed ID yet, picked up off Route 9, single GSW to the left lateral thorax, entry wound visible, no confirmed exit. BP was 80/50 on scene, down to 72/40 in transport. GCS 14 responding to voice. The patient was large, heavy set, somewhere between late 30s and mid 40s, his shirt already cut away. His skin was the color of wet concrete. His breathing was wrong, shallow, and too fast, with a quality that Lena clocked in the first 3 seconds. She was walking beside the gurney, hand on the rail, eyes moving across his chest and abdomen in a continuous, systematic sweep. She saw it before he was fully transferred to the trauma bay table. The abdomen was distending. Subtle, you could miss it if you weren't specifically looking, but measurable, and coupled with the BP trajectory and the quality of his breath sounds, It pointed somewhere specific. It pointed toward the aorta. Dr. Holt arrived in the trauma bay 40 seconds later, snapping his gloves on. He'd been doing a consult on the third floor. He scanned the monitors, scanned the patient, and moved to the head of the bed with the particular efficiency of someone who'd already formed a theory and was now looking for evidence to support it. Penetrating trauma, left thorax, possible hemopneumothorax. Let's get a chest film. Dr. Holt, Lena kept her voice even. His abdomen is distending. I want to flag possible abdominal aortic involvement. Holt looked at her briefly. The look lasted less than a second. The wound track is thoracic. Entry point is thoracic, but the trajectory, depending on angle, could have clipped the upper abdominal aorta or a major branch. His pressure's been dropping faster than an isolated hemothorax typically produces, and his belly is... Nurse. He said it the way some people said enough. Calm, final, with just enough edge to close the conversation. Get me a chest film and have the thoracic tray ready, and check the blood supply. I want 4 units of O-neg standing by. Lena held still for one breath. The chest film will take time we might not have if this is aortic. I appreciate the input. He turned away. Chest film, now. She moved to the supply cart the way he'd directed, but she didn't stop thinking. She asked Pete quietly to have a laparotomy tray on standby in addition to the thoracic set, giving him a reason that had nothing to do with overriding the attending and everything to do with being prepared. Pete gave her a look that meant, "Are you sure about this?" And she gave him one back that meant, "Yes, please just do it." He did it. He trusted her in the specific, unspoken way that came from 3 years of shared shifts and never once being wrong. The chest film came back in 6 minutes. It showed a moderate hemothorax on the left side, blood accumulating around the lung, consistent with Holt's hypothesis. He ordered a chest tube and began moving with the confidence of someone whose theory had just been validated. Lena looked at the film, then looked at the patient's abdomen again, and felt the cold, specific certainty of knowing something that you could not yet prove. The abdomen was distending faster. She checked the most recent BP reading. 68/38. That was too fast. The hemothorax alone didn't account for that rate of decline. She moved to Holt's side, not in front of him, not aggressively. She stood at the correct angle for a person providing relevant information to a physician, and she said it clearly. His pressure is dropping faster than the chest film accounts for. I'm seeing progressive abdominal distension. I think we need to consider exploratory. We are managing the confirmed injury. Holt did not look at her. He was preparing for the chest tube insertion, focused, competent, doing exactly what the film supported. If you cannot work within the clinical decision I've made, you can step back and let someone else run supplies. The room was quiet for a moment. 2 other nurses were present, a younger woman named Kara, who kept her eyes on the monitors, and a tech named Dominic, who had gone still near the wall. Lena stepped back. She did not leave the room. She moved to her assigned position near the supply cart, and she watched. The chest tube went in cleanly. Blood drained, a significant amount, which confirmed the hemothorax and, for a moment, seemed to justify everything Holt had said. The monitors showed a brief, marginal improvement in BP 64/35. The team exhaled slightly. Lena did not exhale. She watched the abdomen. Over the next 4 minutes, the distension continued. Not dramatically. Nothing that would trigger an alarm, nothing that would make a person glance up from their work and say, "Wait." But it was there, visible if you were looking, measurable if you knew what baseline to compare it against. The patient's respirations were becoming more labored. His color, already bad, was not improving the way it should have with the chest drainage underway. She was running the physiology in her head the way she'd learned to run it in a different context, in a different country, in a different uniform, quickly, without sentiment, focusing on what the body was telling her rather than what the diagnosis said it should be doing. The body was telling her the bleeding hadn't stopped. The body was telling her it was coming from somewhere the chest tube couldn't reach. Holt made the incision at 12:23. He opened the left thoracic cavity for direct exploration, a logical next step given his working diagnosis. His technique was precise, his hands were steady. He was operating on the correct assumption given the information he'd chosen to consider. The monitor flatlined at 12:26, not the alarm then recovery pattern of a treatable arrhythmia. The sudden, absolute collapse of pressure, that meant the cardiovascular system had reached a point it could not sustain. The team moved, paddles, compressions, a second IV line, and Holt called instructions rapidly, but there was something different in his voice now, a frequency that hadn't been there before, something tight. Lena was already moving. She moved past Kara, past Dominic, past the medication cart. She moved to the table. "Dr. Holt." Her voice was not loud. It was the specific quality of voice that stops people. Not volume, but certainty. "I need to check his abdomen."
"We are doing CPR. His aorta is bleeding. That's why the pressure dropped. The chest tube addressed the hemothorax. This is separate." She was pulling on fresh gloves as she spoke. "I need 60 seconds. You do not have authorization to... He's going to die in the next 2 minutes if we don't address the abdominal source." She met Holt's eyes directly. This was not a request anymore. "I am telling you what I see. 60 seconds. The monitor was still sounding the flat line.
Dominic was doing compressions. Kara was drawing epinephrine. Holt looked at her. Something moved across his face that she didn't have time to categorize. "Do it," he said. It came out clipped, reluctant, and possibly later he would remember it differently. But he said it. She palpated the abdomen in 3 seconds. Distension confirmed, rigidity confirmed, the specific quality of internal hemorrhage that she had felt before in places she didn't talk about, and then she did what the situation required. Her hands found the major vessel by a combination of anatomical knowledge and tactile memory that she'd built in conditions far less controlled than this trauma bay. She applied direct pressure. She called for the specific clamp she needed by its exact name, calmly, once. Pete had the laparotomy tray ready. He handed it to her without a word. The hemorrhage was from a branch of the superior mesenteric artery, clipped, as she had suspected, by the bullet's trajectory after it cleared the thoracic cavity. A wound that the chest imaging hadn't shown and that the thoracic exploration would never have reached. She isolated it. She clamped it. She held pressure while the anesthesiologist pushed volume and the monitors began slowly to show something other than nothing. 62/20, 70/30, 78/40. She had made approximately 4 decisions that would have required a surgical consult under normal parameters. She had made them without being asked and without formal authorization, in a room where the attending physician was present and had not explicitly directed her to do any of it. She was aware of that. The patient's rhythm stabilized at 12:31. Nobody in the room said anything for almost 8 seconds. Then Holt said, "Get vascular surgery on the phone. I want them in here in 10 minutes. He didn't say anything else to her. He moved to the opposite side of the table and began directing the continuation of the resuscitation as if she were simply part of the equipment, useful, accounted for, not worth acknowledging directly. Lena held the clamp steady and did not look at him. The patient was breathing on his own by 1:15 in the morning. He was moved to the ICU at 2:40. The vascular surgeon who came in, a compact, precise woman named Dr. Ellison, took one look at the abdominal repair, asked who had placed the clamp, and was told the night nurse in a tone that suggested it was not a compliment. Dr. Ellison looked at the repair for another moment without commenting, then began her own assessment. Lena wrote her nursing notes at the station for the next 40 minutes. She documented what she observed, what she communicated, what interventions were performed, and when. She was specific. She was accurate. She did not editorialize. Pete sat beside her at the station and didn't say anything for a while. Then, "I'm going to check on the waiting room," she said. She meant I don't want to talk about it yet, and Pete, who knew her, understood that. The waiting room was nearly empty at that hour. A man in his 50s asleep across 2 chairs, a teenage girl scrolling her phone with the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been there too long. Lena walked through, checked the intake board, exchanged a few words with the triage nurse at the front desk, and then stood for a moment near the vending machine at the end of the corridor. She pressed her fingers against the cold metal of the machine and breathed. This was the thing about the night shift. It gave you the specific kind of quiet that let you feel exactly how much something had cost you right after it happened, before you'd had time to build the wall back up. She'd operated on a man without authorization. She'd contradicted an attending physician twice, been dismissed twice, and then done it anyway. She'd been right. The patient was alive. She wasn't sure any of that was going to matter by morning. She went back to the station. She finished her notes. She took a new admit at 3:10.
a woman with a dislocated shoulder from a fall, and treated her with the steady, matter-of-fact competence that the woman probably didn't know she was receiving from someone whose hands had just done something entirely different 90 minutes earlier. At 5:45, with the shift winding toward handoff, Dr. Marcus Holt appeared at the nurse's station. He was changed out of his surgical gear. He had a tablet in his hand, and his expression had the particular quality of someone who has made a decision and wants to deliver it before they can second-guess themselves. Vasquez. She looked up from the chart she was closing. I need your badge. She held his gaze. Excuse me? Effective immediately. You're suspended pending investigation. He set the tablet on the desk. She could see a form on the screen. Hospital letterhead, her name, a series of checkboxes. You performed unauthorized surgical procedures on a patient under my direct care. You ignored physician directives and you physically displaced me from the operating field. The station was quiet. 2 nurses down the corridor had stopped moving. Lena said carefully, The patient is alive because of what I did. The patient is alive, Holt said, because of a trauma team response that you disrupted and compromised. You performed interventions outside your scope of practice. That's not something I can overlook regardless of outcome. You told me to do it. I told you to check his abdomen. I did not authorize surgical intervention. He said it smoothly, in the voice of someone who had already rehearsed this version. Your badge, please. She looked at the form on the tablet. She looked at the list of violations. Unauthorized surgical procedure, insubordination, physical displacement of attending physician. 3 separate boxes, all checked. Then she looked at Holt. His face was controlled, but she could see very precisely what was underneath it. Not guilt, exactly. Something colder. The calculation of a man who understood that the truth, in its actual form, was dangerous to him. A surgeon who froze when the monitors crashed. A surgeon who'd made the wrong diagnosis and then sent the nurse to check supplies so she couldn't keep challenging him. A surgeon who had, at the critical moment, said do it, and would spend the rest of his career making sure no one in that room remembered it that way. She unclipped her badge. She set it on the desk between them. She did not throw it. She did not slam it. She placed it with the exact, deliberate care of someone who wanted it to be very clear, later, that she had been composed. My notes are complete, she said. All interventions are documented with timestamps. Holt picked up the badge. He did not respond. She took her jacket from the hook behind the station chair. She took her bag from the bottom drawer, and she walked toward the exit. At the door, Pete called after her. His voice was low, strained. Lena. I'm fine, she said. Check on the patient in Bay 3. He was asking for water an hour ago, and I think we forgot. She pushed through the exit door into the early morning cold and walked to her car. She sat in it for a while without starting it. The man she'd kept alive was in the ICU right now, sedated, stabilized, with no idea what the last 6 hours had cost the person who'd saved his life. He didn't know her name. She didn't know his. Not really, not beyond what the paramedics had said on intake, and even that was a placeholder. She would probably never speak to him. That was fine. That wasn't why she'd done it. She started the car. 50 feet away inside the hospital, in the ICU on the 2nd floor, the patient opened his eyes for the first time since the ambulance bay. His vision cleared slowly. The ceiling, the equipment, the quiet. A nurse came to check his vitals. He watched her move, tracked the room, ran a quick automatic assessment of his situation with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent decades learning how to orient himself fast in unfamiliar environments. His name was not Marcus Webb. That was the name on the intake form because it was the name on the wallet in his jacket, which was not his jacket. His actual name was classified for reasons that went above the pay grade of everyone currently in this building. He remembered the trauma bay. He remembered the monitors. He remembered the silence that had followed the alarm. And he remembered, with the particular clarity that crisis sometimes creates, a woman's voice. Calm, precise, not asking permission. His aorta is bleeding. That's why the pressure dropped. He remembered a face, focused, unreadable, moving with the specific economy of someone who had done difficult things in difficult places and had learned not to waste motion. He knew that kind of person. He'd served with them. Nurse, he said. His voice came out rougher than he expected. The nurse who was in the trauma bay when I came in. The one who... He paused, recalibrated. What happened to her?
The nurse who'd come to check his vitals, young, a little startled by him being awake, shook her head slowly. I wasn't on shift for that. I can try to find out. Please, he said. Find out. He closed his eyes again. His right hand moved to the edge of the mattress, where there was nothing. No weapon, no radio, no kit. For the first time in a long time, he was somewhere that left him genuinely unable to act, dependent on people he didn't know, in a city he'd passed through for reasons he couldn't share. He lay still and waited. But somewhere underneath the sedation and the morphine and the specific humility of being a person who had almost died, something was moving. The professional instinct that had kept him alive through 2 decades of situations that shouldn't have had survivors. The knowledge that the woman who'd saved him was not in this building anymore. And the certainty, cold, patient, absolute, that whatever had happened to her because of it was not going to stand. He lay still and waited a long time before the nurse came back. She was young, maybe 26, with the slightly apologetic expression of someone delivering news they'd had to work to obtain. She stood at the edge of his bed and told him that the nurse he was asking about had been suspended. That morning, before the shift change, that she'd left the building around 6 a.m. and hadn't returned. He didn't respond immediately. He looked at the ceiling and ran the information through the same analytical process he applied to everything, stripping out emotion, isolating facts, identifying what each fact meant in sequence. A nurse saves a patient's life using interventions outside her documented scope. The attending surgeon, whose diagnosis was wrong, files the complaint. The nurse is removed before anyone thinks to question the version of events they've been given. The patient, him, is in the ICU, sedated, listed under a false name, with no apparent connection to anyone who might complicate the story. Clean, fast. The kind of move you made when you wanted the inconvenient person gone before she could talk to anyone who mattered. He'd seen it before. Different context, same architecture. What's her name? He asked. The young nurse hesitated. I'm not sure I should. Her name, he said again. Not louder. Just more final. Vasquez. Lena Vasquez. He filed it and closed his eyes, and the young nurse took that as dismissal and left, and the room went quiet again except for the hum of the equipment and the distant sound of the floor going about its morning. His name was not Marcus Webb. His name was Garrett Solis, and he held a rank and clearance that made the false name on his intake form a standard operational precaution rather than a deception. He'd been in Denton Falls for 36 hours on a transit assignment. Nothing active, nothing complex. The kind of movement that happened without incident 9 times out of 10. The 10th time involved Route 9, and a shooter whose identity he did not yet know, and whose existence meant that what had been a routine transit was now something else entirely. He needed a phone. He needed his actual identification. He needed someone from his chain of command to know he was alive and where he was. He pressed the call button. It took 11 minutes for someone to come, which told him something about staffing levels. A different nurse this time, older, efficient, not interested in conversation. He asked for his personal effects. She told him they'd been secured by the hospital when he came in under the false name, that the admitting documentation listed him as unidentified, and that his belongings would be held until identity was confirmed. I need to make a phone call, he said. There's a hospital phone at the nurse's station. A secure phone call. She looked at him with the particular expression of a person deciding whether this was a medical problem or a personnel problem. I'll see what I can do, she said, which meant she was going to do nothing specific and hope he forgot about it. He didn't forget about it. He waited until she left, then spent 2 minutes assessing his physical condition with clinical detachment. Abdominal pain, significant but manageable. 2 IV lines. No restraints. Movement was going to hurt. That was a fact rather than an obstacle. He carefully moved to a sitting position and stayed there until the pain leveled off, then located his IV pole and used it as a support to stand. He made it to the window before the pain made further argument. Denton Falls in the early morning. Low skyline, industrial eastern edge, the sun coming up flat and pale over a city that was already at work. He'd been to worse places. He'd been in worse condition. He needed Lena Vasquez's nursing notes, not because he doubted what had happened. He'd been there, he'd felt it, he'd heard her voice when everything else had gone silent,
but because documentation was armor and whatever Holt was building against her would need to be met with something that couldn't be revised after the fact. He got back to bed before the next vitals check. He did not ask again about the phone. He had a different approach in mind, and it required patience he didn't particularly feel, but had long ago learned to manufacture. At 9:14 that morning, a man named Ruiz walked into the ICU. Garrett had been expecting someone for the past 2 hours, and Ruiz was who they sent, mid-40s, dressed like a hospital administrator, which meant the jacket was slightly too good for the role and the shoes gave him away entirely. He sat down beside the bed without being invited and handed Garrett a burner phone without speaking, the way you handed someone something they'd asked for before you knew what they were going to do with it. "Sit rep," Garrett said. "Shooter is unidentified. Local PD has the scene but not the context." Ruiz kept his voice low and even. "Your cover held. The hospital has you as web pending ID verification. It's going to hold for about another 4 hours before someone on their admin side starts asking questions about insurance." Garrett set the phone on the blanket. "I need something else." "What?" "The nurse who saved my life last night was suspended this morning by the surgeon whose mistake she corrected. I need everything that happened in that trauma bay documented and preserved before someone at this hospital figures out how to lose it." Ruiz was quiet for a moment. "That's not exactly in the operational. She had approximately 12 minutes to live, Ruiz, because of a surgeon who was wrong and knew he was wrong and still sent her to the supply cart." Garrett looked at him directly. "I need the documentation preserved. Camera footage, monitor telemetry, nursing notes, everything time-stamped before last night's shift ended. Can you do that, or do I need to call someone above you?" Ruiz had the look of a man recalculating several things simultaneously. "I can make some inquiries." "That's not the same as yes. I'll get it done. Today." Ruiz left. Garrett lay back and stared at the ceiling and thought about Lena Vasquez driving away from this hospital at 6 in the morning with her badge in someone else's hand and her nursing notes sitting in a system that the right administrator could edit with enough motivation. He thought about 12 minutes, the window between when she'd first raised the concern and when Holt had dismissed it. 12 minutes during which the correct diagnosis had been available, and the person who held it had been told in the specific language of institutional authority that her job was to fetch supplies and be quiet. He knew that language. He'd heard it applied to people he respected, in rooms where the person holding rank was wrong and knew it, and where being wrong wasn't the problem because rank protected you from the consequences of being wrong. It was one of the oldest dynamics in any hierarchical institution, military or medical or otherwise. It was also, in his experience, one of the things that institutions could address when they chose to, and one of the things they frequently chose not to. He was going to make sure this one didn't get that choice. Lena's apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had once been a textile warehouse and still had the bones of it. High ceilings, concrete floors, windows that let in more weather than they should have. She'd lived there for 4 years. She liked the concrete. It didn't pretend to be softer than it was. She got home at 6:45, made coffee she didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table with her jacket still on. The suspension paperwork was on her phone. A formal notification from the hospital's HR department sent at 6:32 a.m. with a copy to the state nursing board. It listed 4 violations. The 4th one hadn't been on the tablet Holt showed her at the station. It read, "Misrepresentation of clinical findings to attending physician." She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on the table and looked at the window. The misrepresentation charge was the one that mattered. The first 3, unauthorized procedure, insubordination, physical displacement, were arguable. They were charges that could be contextualized, challenged, explained through documentation. But misrepresentation of clinical findings was a different category. That charge touched her nursing license at the root. That charge said she hadn't just overstepped. It said she'd lied. And a lying nurse who performed unauthorized surgery on a patient was not a nurse with a difficult situation to navigate. She was a liability, and liabilities got their licenses pulled. She pressed her fingers flat against the table. The 4th charge had been added after she left the building, after her notes were already in the system. She understood what that meant. Someone had looked at what she documented and decided that her version of events, specific, time-stamped, clinically accurate, was a threat.
and that the fastest way to neutralize it was to make everything she said, including her notes, the product of a person who'd already been categorized as dishonest. It was precise. It was fast. And it would work. Unless there was something in that trauma bay she hadn't known about. Her phone rang. She looked at it. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Vasquez, she said. A pause. Then a voice she didn't recognize, male, measured, with the specific economy of someone who didn't use words decoratively. I was in Trauma Bay 1 last night. I understand you've been suspended. She went very still. Who is this? Someone who was conscious for more of that procedure than the surgical team realized. Another pause. I heard everything you said to Dr. Holt, both times. That's... She stopped. Started again. How did you get this number? It's on your personnel file, which I had access to through channels I'm not going to explain on this line. The voice remained even, unhurried. I need you to know that there is documentation being preserved as we speak. Telemetry, camera footage, nursing notes as they existed at the time of submission, before any revisions. Her breath stopped for half a second. What do you mean, revisions? Your notes were accessed at 7:41 this morning by someone with administrative credentials. The original version has been preserved. The version currently in the hospital system is not identical to what you submitted. She stood up from the table without deciding to. She walked to the window and stood there with the phone pressed to her ear and her other hand against the cold glass. They changed my notes, she said. Not a question. Specific language was altered. I don't have the full comparison yet, but the access was logged and the original is secured. Who are you? The voice didn't answer that directly. You should get a lawyer, today, if possible. Someone who handles medical licensing cases and isn't afraid of institutional pushback. A brief pause. Don't sign anything the hospital sends you without legal counsel. Don't respond to the nursing board notification yet. And don't talk to Dr. Holt or anyone from hospital administration. Why are you... She stopped herself, reconsidered the question. Why does this matter to you? Because you made the right call under pressure with someone telling you explicitly that you were wrong, and you did it anyway. The voice was still even, but something shifted in it, not warmth exactly. Something more austere than warmth. Recognition. That's not a small thing. The line went quiet. She stood at the window for a long time after that, watching the street below, where the city was moving through its morning with no knowledge of any of this. The ER at 2 a.m., the man on the table, the surgeon at the nurse's station with her badge in his hand. Her coffee was cold. She poured it out and made more. She needed a lawyer. She knew one, Marta Osei, who had gone through the same nursing program 6 years before Lena and had pivoted into healthcare law after a malpractice case she'd witnessed as an intern that she described when pressed as the thing that broke my faith in the system but not in accountability. She'd given Lena her card 3 years ago at a hospital fundraiser. Lena had kept it in her wallet without knowing why. She found it in the card slot behind her insurance card and called the number. Marta picked up on the third ring, already sounding alert at 7:15 a.m. in a way that suggested she was either a morning person or already at work. Lena gave her the short version: trauma bay, suspension, 4 charges, nursing board notification, altered notes. She kept it factual and sequential. She did not editorialize. When she finished, Marta was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, they added the misrepresentation charge after you left? It wasn't on the form he showed me at 6 a.m. It was in the HR notification at 6:32. And the notes were accessed at 7:41 with administrative credentials? According to the source who called me, yes. Do you have independent verification of the original notes? Not in my possession, but they may be preserved elsewhere. Marta was quiet again, a thinking quiet, not a worried one. Don't respond to the board. Don't respond to HR. Don't go back to the hospital. Get me the name of the charge nurse who was on shift and anyone else in that trauma bay, because I'm going to need witnesses who saw what actually happened. A pause. And Lena, this is going to get messier before it gets better. I want you to know that, up front. I know, Lena said. Do you have documentation of the original misrepresentation claim? Anything in writing from Holt before you left? Just the tablet he showed me. I didn't take a photo of it. Okay, that's okay. What time does your shift normally? Marta stopped. Right. You're suspended. Okay. Another pause, shorter. I'll file for an emergency stay on the board notification today. That buys us time. Can you get me a list of everyone present in that trauma bay from the moment the patient arrived until you left the room? Lena went to the kitchen drawer where she kept a notepad and started writing names. By 10 a.m., Harlow General Hospital had released a brief internal statement to staff. Lena Vasquez, RN, had been suspended pending an investigation into unauthorized clinical interventions during the previous night's emergency response. The statement used the word unauthorized 3 times in 4 sentences, which was not subtle, but was, as institutional communications went, effective. It framed the situation before most of the staff had time to talk to anyone who'd actually been in the room. Kara, the younger nurse who'd been in the trauma bay, read the statement on her break and felt something uncomfortable move through her chest. She'd been in the room. She'd watched Lena work. She'd seen Holt's face when the monitor crashed, the specific blankness of it, the second where he'd gone still in a way that someone less focused on the patient might have missed. She hadn't said anything when Holt dismissed Lena's first assessment. She hadn't said anything the second time either. She sat in the break room and stared at the statement on her phone and thought about that. Dominic, the tech who'd been against the wall, was less conflicted. He'd been at Harlow General for 8 months and had no particular attachment to anyone involved, which meant he processed what he'd seen with the reasonably clean logic of someone who hadn't yet learned that being a witness was different from being safe. He mentioned it to a colleague over lunch. That nurse who got suspended actually saved the guy's life. I was right there and didn't think much about it beyond that. The colleague he mentioned it to happened to be friends with a junior reporter at the Denton Falls Register. That connection didn't matter yet, but it would. Dr. Marcus Holt spent the morning in his office on the 3rd floor, reviewing the case file he'd put together. He was not careless about it. He was in fact thorough, the kind of thorough that came from being intelligent enough to know that a false story needed the same internal consistency as a true one, more so, because true stories had the luxury of being incomplete. He'd revised 3 sections of the clinical narrative. The revisions were not dramatic. They were the kind of small, targeted adjustments that shifted emphasis and sequence without changing anything that could be definitively contradicted by physical evidence. The chest tube, for instance, remained the correct response to the confirmed hemothorax because it was, because the chest film had shown it, because that part of his decision-making had been sound. He hadn't changed that. What he'd changed was the account of how the abdominal exploration began. In the current version of the record, the decision to investigate the abdomen followed naturally from his own intraoperative assessment based on indicators he observed after the chest tube was placed. Lena Vasquez's name appeared in the record in its correct functional role. She was the nurse on duty, she assisted, she executed. But the clinical observations, the concerns raised, the decision to change course, those were attributed to the physician of record. The one thing he hadn't been able to adjust cleanly was the telemetry. The monitor data was automatically time-stamped and stored in a system he didn't control. And while he could have flagged it for review, flagging it would create a record of the flag, which created its own problem. He decided to leave it and trust that the people reviewing the case would default to the narrative in the clinical notes rather than cross-referencing every monitor timestamp. He believed that was the correct bet. He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet. He submitted the finalized documentation to the Chief of Medicine's office at 11:20. He went to check on 2 post-op patients after that, both routine, both recovering normally, and then had lunch in the physician's lounge, where he sat alone because he preferred it and told himself the discomfort in his shoulders was from the procedure and not from anything else. Quote, at 11:40, a man named Ruiz walked into the medical records office on the 1st floor of Harlow General and presented credentials that technically identified him as a federal medical compliance auditor. The credentials were real. They were just connected to a designation that was more specific than the title suggested, and that specificity wasn't something the records coordinator had the context to evaluate. She pulled up the access logs for the night of the event. She pulled up the original time-stamped nursing notes from the submission window. She printed them on paper rather than transferring them digitally at Ruiz's request and handed the stack to him in a folder. He also asked for the OR telemetry archive from Trauma Bay 1 between the hours of midnight and 2 a.m. She looked at him for a moment. That's not typically requested by compliance. It's a cross-system audit. The paperwork is in the queue. He said it neutrally, without impatience, in the tone of someone for whom bureaucratic friction was a familiar texture rather than an obstacle. She pulled the telemetry. He took everything and left before noon. Lena was on her third cup of coffee and her second hour of reading every piece of documentation she'd ever saved from her nursing career, credentialing records, continuing education certificates, performance reviews, commendations, when her phone rang again. Different unknown number. She answered it with the same lack of expectation she'd developed about unknown numbers in the past 6 hours. Is this Lena Vasquez? Female voice, professional. Not warm, but not unkind either. Who's asking? My name is Special Agent Diane Farrow. I'm with the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General. A brief pause. I'd like to speak with you about an event at Harlow General Hospital last night. Specifically, I'd like to hear your account of what happened in Trauma Bay 1 before any formal proceedings begin. Lena sat down slowly. How did you... A concern was flagged through a federal channel this morning. I'm not in a position to tell you more than that right now. Another pause. Ms. Vasquez, you're not in trouble with my office. I want to be clear about that, but I'd like to speak with you today if possible. I have an attorney. That's your right. She's welcome to be present. Lena stared at the wall across from her kitchen table. The wall had a framed topographic map of a mountain range she'd hiked 2 summers ago. The kind of thing you put up because it means something and also because it fills the space. She'd looked at it 100 times without really seeing it. She looked at it now. Miss Vasquez? When? She said. This afternoon. I can come to you. She thought about the man in the ICU, the one whose name she didn't know, whose face she'd memorized in the particular way she memorized faces in crisis, because crisis required that. She thought about the voice on the phone this morning. That's not a small thing. 2 o'clock, she said. I'll text you the address. Thank you. The call ended. She sat still for 30 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called Marta Osei and said, We have a federal agent who wants to talk to me today. OIG. Marta's response was immediate and unambiguous. Don't say a word to her without me in the room. I know. I mean it. Not one word about the clinical events. Not a summary. Not a clarification. Nothing. You tell her your attorney will be present, and then you wait for me. 2 o'clock. Can you make it? I'll move things. A pause. Lena. An OIG agent doesn't reach out to a suspended nurse in a routine malpractice situation. Whatever is happening here is bigger than Holt being wrong and covering it up. I know, Lena said again. She didn't know the full shape of it yet, but she could feel the edges of it, the way you could feel the edges of a room in the dark before your eyes adjusted. The unknown patient on the ICU bed who'd asked for her name. The federal credentials. The documentation being preserved before anyone had time to revise it. Something was in motion that had started before her suspension and would continue long after Holt thought this was already resolved. At 1:15, she showered, changed into clean clothes, made herself eat something, toast, not because she was hungry but because she understood the mechanics of keeping herself functional, and sat at the table with a legal pad, writing a clear, sequential account of everything she remembered from the night before. She wrote for 30 minutes without stopping. She wrote the way she'd been trained to document, specific, timed where possible, free of interpretation. She wrote what she'd seen, what she'd said, what she'd been told, what she'd done and when. She wrote the moment she'd placed the clamp and the monitor reading that followed. She wrote Marcus Holt's exact words at the nurse's station, as close to verbatim as she could reconstruct. When she finished, she read it back once. It was 14 pages. She was still reading it when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, a different one from this morning, but the same sparse quality to the message. Room 214. He's awake. He's asking for you by name. She stared at the message. The man in the ICU, the unidentified patient, the one whose life she'd held in her hands for 4 minutes at 12:26 in the morning while the monitor showed nothing. He knew her name. She put the legal pad in her bag, put her jacket on, and looked at the clock. She had 45 minutes before Marta arrived and the federal agent after that. She called Marta. I need to make a stop first, she said. There's something I need to understand before 2 o'clock. What kind of stop? She looked at the text again, room 214. The patient, she said. He's awake. Silence on the line for a moment. Then Marta carefully. Lena, if he's connected to whatever the OIG is involved in, talking to him before the meeting could...
I know the risks. Do you? She thought about that honestly. I know some of them, she said, but I think not going is also a risk, and I think I need to make that call myself. Another silence. Then Marta exhaled. Not agreement exactly, but the sound of a person accepting that their client was going to do what their client was going to do and adjusting accordingly.
Be at your apartment by 1:50. Don't be late.
I won't.
She ended the call, picked up her bag and keys, walked to the door. She stood there for a second with her hand on the knob, thinking about walking back into a hospital where her badge had been taken 4 hours ago, where a surgeon was on the 3rd floor right now, building a story, where every administrator had received a statement that used the word unauthorized 3 times in 4 sentences. Then she thought about the clamp, the monitor reading that followed.
78/40. She opened the door.
She didn't go through the main entrance. She went through the ambulance bay, the back route habit of a person who'd spent 3 years on nights, and took the east stairwell to the 2nd floor. Nobody stopped her. Nobody looked at her twice. In scrubs and a jacket, moving with purpose through a hospital corridor, she looked exactly like what she'd been 24 hours ago. Room 214 was at the far end of the ICU. The curtain was half drawn. She stopped outside and looked in. He was awake, propped up at a slight angle, and whatever the morphine had been doing to him earlier had apparently backed off enough to leave him alert. He didn't look like a man who'd been in cardiac arrest 7 hours ago. His eyes were clear and he was watching the door in the specific way of someone who'd heard footsteps in the corridor and had already decided what he was going to do when whoever it was arrived. When he saw her, something in his face shifted. Not relief, something more controlled than that. Recognition. And underneath it, the particular gravity of a person who owed a debt they understood. She stepped inside. You asked for me. Yes. His voice was still rough but functional. Close the curtain. She did. I don't know your real name, she said. No, you don't. He looked at her steadily. What I can tell you is that the people who need to know what you did last night already know it. Documentation is being secured that can't be revised or buried. She studied him. The phone call this morning was from you. No, from someone working on my behalf. He paused. Vasquez. I've been in situations where someone made the right call under pressure and took the consequences for it. I've also been in situations where that consequence wasn't corrected. Something moved in his expression. Not anger, but something that had once been anger and had become something more useful. I'm not letting this one go uncorrected. You don't even know me. I know what you did, and I know what it costs when you do the right thing in a room where the wrong person has the title. He shifted slightly, winced, controlled it. There's a federal investigation opening today. It's going to look at everything that happened in that trauma bay and everything that happened in this hospital's record system this morning. I need you to know that going into whatever meeting you have this afternoon. She didn't ask how he knew about the meeting. What are you? She asked instead. He held her gaze. He didn't answer the question. Okay, she said. Then I'll ask you something else. She took one step closer to the bed. Was it enough? What I did? Was it actually... Did it work, or did I just buy him time before something else? The repair held. His voice was quiet but definite. The vascular surgeon confirmed it this morning. The clamp placement was precise. If you'd waited another 60 seconds, the bleed would have been unrecoverable. A pause. You didn't wait. She exhaled. It wasn't the sound of relief. It was the sound of something that had been braced against an impact finally getting to put its weight down. She stood there for a moment in room 214, with the city outside the window going about its business, and the ICU floor moving quietly beyond the curtain, and she let herself feel, for exactly as long as she could afford to, the specific weight of having done the thing correctly and paid the price for it anyway. Then she straightened her jacket, picked up her bag. I have to go. I know. She pulled the curtain back, stopped. The fourth charge, she said, without turning fully around.
Misrepresentation. They added it after I left. I know that too. They changed my notes. The original is preserved. She nodded. She walked out of the room. She was in the east stairwell heading for the exit when her phone buzzed with a call from Marta. She answered it. Change of plans, Marta said. The attorney's voice was different now, tighter, moving faster. Farrow isn't coming alone. She's bringing someone from the U.S. Attorney's office. Lena stopped on the landing between the second and first floor. Why? She said. Because apparently what happened last night touched something they were already watching. I don't have details yet, but Lena... Marta paused. This isn't just about you anymore. Whatever that patient is, whatever he's connected to, it's opened something, and you're in the middle of it. Lena stood on the landing and looked down the stairwell at the exit door 1 floor below. How much trouble am I in? She asked. With the federal side? None. With the hospital? Marta's voice was controlled but honest. That depends on what happens in the next 24 hours. Someone in that building is about to realize that the person they moved against this morning had a witness they didn't account for. And when they realize that, then we find out how far Holt is willing to take this. The door at the bottom of the stairwell opened. Lena looked down. A man in a dark suit was standing in the doorway, looking up at her, with a second person visible just behind him. Older, in a gray jacket, with the kind of bearing that didn't come from a desk job. He looked up at her with the expression of someone who had just confirmed what he'd been told, and there was something in it that made her go completely still. He wasn't from the hospital. He was from somewhere else entirely. And he was here for her. She didn't move for a full second. The man in the gray jacket didn't move either. He just looked up at her from the base of the stairwell with that settled, assessing quality, the kind of stillness that wasn't passive. It was the stillness of someone who had already run the variables and arrived at a conclusion before the other person had finished processing the situation. Then he said, Miss Vasquez, I'm General Raymond Talco, U.S. Army. I think we need to talk. The name meant nothing to her. The rank landed differently. She'd known enough people who carried that rank to understand what it represented in terms of access, authority, and the specific weight of showing up somewhere in person rather than sending someone else. She came down the last flight of stairs. The man beside Talco, the one in the dark suit, stepped back to give her room, which told her he was staff rather than principal. Talco himself didn't step back. He shook her hand when she reached the landing, a brief, firm grip, and looked at her with the direct evaluation of someone who'd been given a file and was now checking it against the actual person. I've read your military service record, he said. She kept her face even. I don't have a military service record. I'm a nurse. You have a nursing record, he said. You also have a separate record that isn't in any civilian system. He paused. Combat medic specialist. 2 tours. 3 deployments in the second tour, a commendation for actions in a situation I'm not going to name in a hospital stairwell. He looked at her steadily. That record. The concrete walls of the stairwell felt closer than they had a moment ago. She hadn't hidden it exactly. She just never offered it. The civilian world didn't ask the right questions, and she hadn't seen the point of volunteering answers to questions nobody asked. She was a nurse. She did the work. The rest of it was hers. What does my service record have to do with what happened last night? She said. Directly? Nothing. Talco glanced at the door behind her, then back. The patient in room 214 is connected to an active federal operation. I'm not going to tell you the specifics because you don't have the clearance and because the specifics aren't what I'm here about. He paused again, measured. What I'm here about is that the man in that room asked me, specifically, to make sure that what happened to you last night is not buried. And when Garrett Solis asks me to do something, I take it seriously. She filed the name. It didn't open anything in her memory, no face, no context. But the way Talco said it, the specific weight he gave it, told her enough about what kind of person she'd kept alive. He told you I was suspended, she said. He told me the surgeon who misdiagnosed a patient covered it up by suspending the nurse who caught his mistake. He also told me the hospital system had already been accessed and records altered by this morning. Talco's voice stayed level, but something sharpened in it. I've been doing this for 26 years, Ms. Vasquez. I've seen a lot of things get buried because the person with the title moved faster than the person with the truth. I don't enjoy watching it happen. She was quiet for a moment.
What do you want from me? Your statement, on record, today. He nodded toward the door. There's a conference room on the first floor that the hospital's patient liaison office has made available to us. They don't know why. They were told it was a compliance review. Agent Farrow from OIG is already there. So is an assistant U.S. attorney named Graves. A pause. So is your attorney. She arrived about 4 minutes ago, and I believe she is currently establishing ground rules with some vigor. Something loosened slightly in Lena's chest at that. Marta, establishing ground rules with vigor, was a specific and reliable image. My statement about last night, she said. That's all? Talco looked at her with the patience of someone who'd sat across from people in difficult situations and understood that the complete answer sometimes needed to arrive in pieces. For now, yes. What happens after that depends on what the OIG review finds and what the U.S. attorney decides to pursue. He held the door open. But I want to be direct with you about something first, and I'm telling you this as someone who read your service record this morning and has an opinion about the kind of person it describes. She waited. Dr. Marcus Holt submitted a completed and revised case file to the Chief of Medicine at 11:20 this morning. It has been forwarded to the State Medical Board and to the hospital's legal counsel as the official account of last night's events. His voice didn't change register. In that account, you are described as an unstable and insubordinate nurse who performed reckless, unauthorized interventions on a patient, ignored physician directives, and fabricated clinical concerns after the fact to justify her actions. The word fabricated landed like a fist on a table. He used that word, she said. Flat. In writing, submitted to 3 separate institutional bodies before 10 a.m. Talco let that sit for a second. He moved fast because he's not stupid, and because he understood that the first documented narrative tends to be the one that requires the most effort to dislodge. He paused. What he didn't know is that the telemetry from Trauma Bay 1 is a federal evidence hold as of 8:47 this morning. She looked at him. Every timestamp, he said. Every monitor reading. Every second from the moment the patient arrived to the moment he was transferred to the ICU. He let the door hold. His revised account doesn't match the telemetry at a number of points, including specifically the sequence of events that led to the abdominal intervention. She understood what he was telling her. The telemetry was the thing Holt couldn't revise. It existed in a system he didn't control, and it told a second-by-second story that his clinical narrative had already contradicted in writing under his name submitted to the State Medical Board. He had, in the specific language of people who did what Talco did, made his lie provable. Let's go, she said. The conference room was small, 4 chairs, a table, a window that looked into the interior courtyard rather than outside. Marta Ose was standing when Lena walked in, and the expression on her face was the professionally neutral one she wore when she was actively managing something she found unacceptable. Agent Farrow was seated, 30s, precise, with a tablet and a recorder already on the table. Across from her, a man in his late 40s with reading glasses and a yellow legal pad. Graves, the assistant U.S. attorney, who looked up when Lena entered and gave her the specific evaluating look of someone deciding how a witness is going to hold up. Marta touched Lena's arm briefly. 2 fingers. It meant, I've handled the preliminary terms. Follow my lead. Lena sat down. The statement took 1 hour and 40 minutes. Marta interrupted 4 times, twice, to object to the framing of a question, once to request clarification of what the response would be used for, once to stop Graves from asking about Lena's service record in a way that she characterized as outside the scope of the proceeding. Lena answered what she was permitted to answer. She was specific, sequential, and she did not editorialize. She described what she observed. She described what she communicated to Dr. Holt and when. She described his responses as close to verbatim as she could reconstruct. She described the interventions she performed and the clinical reasoning behind each one. She described the monitor readings at each stage. When she described the moment the flatline alarm changed pitch, and what she did in the 60 seconds following it, Graves stopped writing and just listened. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Farrow said, The access logs for the nursing notes system show an administrative login at 7:41 a.m. We have the original submission and the current version. There are 11 discrete changes. She set a printed comparison on the table. I'd like you to review this and confirm that the original version reflects your documentation as submitted. Lena read the comparison carefully. The changes were surgical, not dramatic. Holt, or whoever had done this on his behalf, was careful enough not to alter anything that could be physically cross-referenced. What they'd changed was the language of her clinical observations. Her note that the abdomen was distending with progressive rigidity, consistent with internal hemorrhage, had been changed to minimal soft tissue asymmetry, noted and monitored. Her documentation of the conversation with Holt, the specific exchange, the exact dismissal, had been reduced to physician informed of nursing observations, deferral to physician judgment per protocol. The effect was to make her notes read as the notes of a nurse who had raised a mild, uncertain concern, been appropriately directed by the physician, and then performed unilateral unauthorized actions for reasons not clinically documented. It was a clean job. She acknowledged that, in the way you could acknowledge that something was well executed while understanding completely that it was designed to end her career. "This is not what I submitted," she said. She turned to the original column. "This is." Farrow made a note. Graves leaned forward. "Ms. Vasquez, do you have any reason to believe that Dr. Holt was aware of the patient's federal connection at any point during the treatment?" Marta said, "You don't have to answer that." "No," Lena said anyway. "I don't think he knew. I think he made a clinical error and then moved very quickly to protect himself from the consequences of it." She paused. "The federal element is separate. What he did was about the mistake, not about who the patient was." Graves nodded, wrote something. "That's consistent with what we believe." "What does that mean for him?" she said. Graves and Farrow exchanged a brief look. Graves said, "Falsification of medical records submitted to a state licensing board is a felony. Falsification of records in a case involving a federal patient, even incidentally, activates additional statutes." He set his pen down. Dr. Holt filed a revised clinical narrative this morning that directly contradicts physical evidence preserved under federal hold. That's not a malpractice question anymore. The room was quiet. Lena thought about Holt at the nurse's station, her badge on the desk between them, the way he'd picked it up without meeting her eyes. "What happens now?" she said. "We complete our review. The OIG opens a formal investigation into the records alteration. The U.S. Attorney's Office determines whether to pursue charges." Graves picked up his pen again. "Your nursing board notification will be stayed pending the outcome of the federal review. Your suspension is," he glanced at Farrow, "a hospital administrative matter, but given the federal evidence hold on the case file, the hospital's legal counsel will be strongly advised that proceeding against you creates significant institutional exposure." Marta, beside her, said nothing. But Lena felt the slight shift in her posture, the specific quality of a person who'd spent the last 6 hours managing a crisis and had just heard the first concrete signal that the crisis had a direction. It wasn't over. It was nowhere close to over. The hospital hadn't made any decisions. Holt hadn't been charged with anything. The nursing board notification was stayed, not withdrawn. The word pending was doing a lot of work in everything Graves had just said, but the telemetry was preserved. The original notes were preserved. A federal agent and an assistant U.S. attorney were in a conference room in the hospital where she'd been suspended 6 hours ago, and the man who'd done it had submitted a falsified document this morning that contradicted every second of time-stamped physical evidence. She'd walked out of this building at 6 a.m. with nothing but 14 pages of handwritten notes and a business card she'd kept in her wallet for 3 years. This was different. She was walking out of a different room. She didn't see Holt on the way out. She took the east corridor to avoid the third floor entirely, Marta beside her, both of them moving without speaking until they reached the main lobby where the afternoon light came in flat and pale through the glass front. Marta stopped at the door. "Go home. Don't respond to anything from the hospital. I'll call you when I have something concrete." "How long?" "Days. Maybe longer." Marta looked at her directly. "You did everything right today. I need you to not do anything that complicates that." "I know." Marta nodded and turned toward the parking structure. Lena pushed through the front door and stepped out into the cold. The courtyard in front of Harlow General was mostly empty at this hour, a man walking a dog along the perimeter path,
A small group near the entrance smoking with the focused economy of people who'd been inside too long.
She walked to her car, which was 3 blocks down in the public lot because she'd come in through the ambulance bay and not the staff garage. And by the time she reached it, the cold had worked its way through her jacket, and she was thinking clearly enough to feel the specific exhaustion of a person who'd been running on adrenaline for 10 hours. She sat in the car. She didn't start it. Her phone showed 2 missed calls, one from a number she didn't recognize, one from Pete Garland. She called Pete back first. He picked up in 2 rings. "Lena, tell me you're okay." "I'm okay." There are people asking questions up here, not from administration. Someone with credentials I've never seen before came through the floor this morning and pulled the original nursing log from last night. The charge coordinator is... It's a whole thing. What kind of credentials? Federal. Some kind of audit designation, but Sheila in records said he had something else with it that she couldn't read the full title of. A pause. Kara came to me at lunch. She wants to talk to someone. She was in the room, Lena. She saw everything. Something moved in Lena's chest. Tell her to call Marta Ose. I'll send you the number. Is it bad? She thought about how to answer that honestly. It's moving, she said. That's all I know right now. She ended the call and sat for another moment. The light was going flat outside, the city shifting toward late afternoon, and the cold was real now against the windows. She picked up the other missed call, dialed back. 1 ring. Then, "Ms. Vasquez," a voice she didn't recognize. Female, efficient. "I'm calling from the office of the hospital's chief of medicine. Dr. Warren Alcott would like to meet with you tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. in his office." She kept her voice neutral. "Regarding?" "He didn't specify. He asked me to convey that it's urgent and that he would appreciate your discretion." She thought about what Graves had said. The hospital's legal counsel will be strongly advised. She thought about how fast Alcott's call had come after the conference room. "Tell him I'll be there," she said. She drove home. She was pulling into her building's parking structure when her phone rang again. Marta this time calling back less than 90 minutes after they'd parted. "Lena." The attorney's voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not alarm, something more precise than alarm. "I just got off the phone with Graves's office. They've moved faster than I expected. A federal warrant has been issued." Lena stopped the car in the middle of the structure. "For who?" she said. A pause on the line. "Marcus Holt was served 40 minutes ago," Marta said. "Falsification of federal medical records, obstruction of a federal investigation, and..." She paused again, and in the pause, Lena heard her attorney choosing words carefully. "And they pulled his full case history. Last night wasn't the first time he altered records. They found 2 prior cases. Different hospitals, different states." The parking structure was very quiet. "How far back?" Lena said. 6 years, Marta said. "The earliest one. The patient didn't make it." The silence in the parking structure lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Lena said, "Send me everything you have," and ended the call. She sat with the engine off and the phone in her hand and did what she'd trained herself to do in moments where the information changed the shape of everything. She let it settle. Not processed, not acted on. Just settle. The way sediment settled in disturbed water. You couldn't see clearly until it stopped moving. 6 years. 2 prior hospitals. 1 patient who hadn't survived. She thought about Holt's face at the nurse's station. The controlled expression, the measured delivery of the suspension. A man who'd done something like this before didn't look frightened doing it again. He looked practiced. That was the specific quality she hadn't been able to name at 6 in the morning when she'd set her badge on the desk. The thing underneath his certainty that wasn't arrogance, exactly. It was the confidence of someone who understood from experience that the institutional machinery moved in his favor. It had moved in his favor before. Twice, at minimum. And a patient had died. She started the car and drove up the ramp and out into the afternoon. Her apartment was cold when she got back. She'd left a window cracked, and the temperature had dropped. She closed it, stood in the kitchen for a moment, then sat at the table with her laptop and the legal pad she'd written her statement on and began to work. Marta sent the information in 3 separate messages over the next 40 minutes. What the U.S. Attorney's Office had shared, which wasn't everything, but was enough to map the outline. The first prior case was from 6 years ago at a hospital in a different state. A 47-year-old patient post-surgical. Deterioration that the attending hadn't caught early enough. Clinical notes that a subsequent review had flagged as inconsistent with the monitor records, but that the review had ultimately attributed to documentation error rather than falsification. The patient died on day 4 of a post-operative complication that the OIG now believed had been identifiable and treatable had the correct clinical picture been documented and acted on. The second case was 4 years ago. Patient survived, but with permanent injury. That case had resulted in a civil settlement, a significant one, confidential, with a non-disclosure agreement that had prevented anyone from connecting it to Holt specifically, rather than to the hospital. 2 hospitals. Holt had moved between them. Not because he'd been pushed out, because he'd advanced. His reputation had followed him. The civil settlement had been institutional, absorbed by the hospital's insurer, attributed to systemic failure rather than physician negligence. His file remained clean. Lena read all of it twice. Then she put the laptop down and looked at the window. The thing that made her chest tighten wasn't the cases themselves. It was the architecture of how he'd survived them. The first case, a review that stopped short of the right conclusion. The second, a settlement that sealed the name. Both times, the institutional machinery had processed the damage and moved on, and Holt had moved with it, carrying a clean file and a growing reputation and the specific unchallenged confidence of a person who'd learned that the system protected him. Until last night, when he'd been wrong in a trauma bay where a federal patient was on the table, and the nurse he'd dismissed had enough clinical knowledge to know exactly what she was seeing. And even then, his first instinct had been to move fast and bury it, because it had worked before. She picked up her phone and called Pete. He answered on the first ring this time. "Kara talked to your lawyer," he said before she could speak. "She called me after. She's shaken up, but she's going to give a statement." "What about Dominic?" A pause. "Dominic's nervous. He's been at the hospital 8 months. He doesn't want to lose the job." "I understand that. I told him what he saw wasn't optional information. It was just what happened." Pete exhaled. "He'll think about it. That's all I got." "Okay?" She paused. "Pete, did you know about the prior cases?" "What prior cases?" "Before tonight, you wouldn't have known. Neither would I." She kept her voice even. "There were 2. At other hospitals. One patient didn't make it." The line was silent long enough that she checked to make sure the call was still connected. "How long has he—" Pete stopped, started again. "How many people went through that man's trauma bay over 6 years and just trusted him?" "A lot," she said, "and nobody caught it. Someone caught it every time. The machinery caught it. It just didn't stop him." Another silence. Then Pete said quietly, "It did this time." She didn't answer that immediately. It was true. It was also the kind of thing that felt fragile to say out loud, like the saying of it could disturb it. "Go home," she said. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." Oh, she was right about that. She arrived at Harlow General at 7:50 the following morning, 8 minutes early, and the lobby already felt different. Not visibly. Same front desk, same patient flow, same institutional quiet of a building that processed human crisis around the clock without ever quite absorbing it. But there were 2 people near the elevator bank she didn't recognize. Suits, lanyards, the particular posture of people who were there for a specific purpose and not trying to blend in. One of them glanced at her as she passed. Not the glance of recognition, the glance of someone confirming an identity against a mental image. She took the elevator to the 4th floor where Dr. Warren Alcott's office occupied a corner with windows on 2 sides, and the particular furnishing of a man who'd been chief of medicine long enough to accumulate both good furniture and enough institutional weight to make it comfortable. She'd been in this office once before, 2 years ago, for a commendation she'd received for a resuscitation protocol she'd helped develop for the night shift. Alcott was already behind his desk. He was in his mid-60s, trim, with the specific quality of stillness that distinguished people who'd learned over decades to be careful before they spoke. There were 2 other people in the room, a woman Lena didn't know, introduced as Harlow General's chief legal counsel, and a man she did know, Graves, the assistant U.S. attorney, who was seated in the chair nearest the window and looked like he'd been there long enough to have formed opinions about the furniture. Marta was already there too, standing near the wall with her notepad and her professionally neutral expression, which sharpened slightly when Lena came through the door. "Ms. Vasquez." Alcott stood, which she hadn't expected. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Thank you for coming." She sat. Marta moved to stand beside her. Alcott remained standing for a moment, which told her he was uncomfortable, not with the situation in the abstract, but with the specific discomfort of a man about to acknowledge, in the presence of a federal prosecutor, that his institution had made a serious error. "I want to be direct with you," he said. "I've spent the last 18 hours reviewing the documentation from Tuesday night, the telemetry, the original nursing notes, the access logs, the revised clinical file that Dr. Holt submitted." He paused. "I also spoke this morning with General Talco." She waited. "Effective immediately, your suspension is rescinded," Alcott said. "The 4 charges filed against you are withdrawn. A formal letter of retraction will be sent to the State Nursing Board today." He looked at her steadily. "I am personally sorry that this happened. The process that was used against you was wrong." The legal counsel beside him was watching Lena with the measured attention of someone monitoring for liability exposure. Graves, by the window, was writing something on his legal pad and not looking up. Lena said, "The misrepresentation charge, the one that was added after I left the building." "Withdrawn," Alcott said. "It was added after my notes were altered in the hospital system." "Yes." Alcott's voice stayed level, but something in it was painful. "We are cooperating fully with the OIG investigation into that access. Whoever made those changes—" He stopped, corrected himself. "The access logs indicate the credentials used belong to a physician administrator. That individual has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation." Not Holt directly, a physician administrator. Someone with system access who'd made the changes on Holt's behalf, or at his direction, or possibly preemptively as a favor. She filed that piece without reacting to it visibly. "What about Dr. Holt?" she said. Alcott sat down. He was quiet for a moment in a way that was not evasive. It was the careful quiet of a man navigating what he could and couldn't say in a room that contained a federal prosecutor. "Dr. Holt was served with a federal warrant yesterday afternoon. He is no longer employed by this hospital. His surgical privileges have been suspended pending the outcome of federal proceedings." A pause. "I cannot speak to the criminal case." "The criminal case," Graves said from the window without looking up, "is ongoing." He finally set down his pen and looked at her. "I can tell you that the charges as filed include falsification of federal medical records, obstruction of a federal investigation, and 2 counts relating to prior incidents that we are treating as a pattern of conduct." He paused. "We are also reviewing the civil settlement from 4 years ago with an eye toward whether the non-disclosure agreement was used to conceal what we now believe was an active pattern." The legal counsel beside Alcott made a small, controlled movement that might have been a wince. Lena looked at Graves. "The patient from 6 years ago, the one who died. That case is being reviewed by the state medical examiner's office in the jurisdiction where it occurred." He held her gaze. "I can't tell you what the conclusion will be. I can tell you that it's being looked at." She'd known that was the answer. She'd asked anyway because the man deserved to be named in a sentence, even if it was an indirect one. She nodded once and let it go, cheered. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. Most of it was administrative, the formal withdrawal documentation, the notification language for the nursing board, the scope of the hospital's cooperation with the federal investigation. Marta asked 7 specific questions and received 6 complete answers, which she noted without comment. The 7th, regarding whether the hospital intended to seek damages from Holt for the institutional exposure his conduct had created, received a response from the legal counsel that was 4 sentences of careful language meaning, "Yes, but we're not discussing specifics today." When it was over, Alcott walked Lena to the door himself. At the threshold, he stopped. "I'd like to offer you something," he said. He said it like a person who'd prepared the sentence and then wasn't sure it was adequate. "Your position is restored. Your record will show no suspension, but I'd also like you to consider, when you're ready, not today, a conversation about the trauma protocol review we've been trying to establish for the night shift. The kind of protocol that might have—" He stopped. "Try it again." We need people in those conversations who understand what actually happens at 2 in the morning in that bay. Not theoretically. Actually. She looked at him for a moment. I'll think about it, she said. It wasn't yes. It wasn't no. It was the honest answer. She walked out. The corridor outside Alcott's office was quiet. Marta fell into step beside her, and they walked toward the elevator without speaking until the doors closed, and they were alone. Then Marta said, "His license is going to be revoked. Not by the hospital, by the board. The federal charges are going to make the board proceeding a formality." "I know." The prior cases, the pattern of conduct argument Graves is building, that's going to be the spine of the criminal case. The Tuesday night incident is the most documentable, but the prior cases establish that it wasn't a mistake. It was a practice. Lena watched the floor numbers descend. "The patient from 6 years ago," she said. "Do they have enough to connect it to him specifically? Or is it still going to land on the hospital?" Marta was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. That's an honest answer. The settlement sealed a lot. Unsealing it takes time and a specific evidentiary argument." She paused. "Graves is smart. He'll push for it if it's there." If, Marta confirmed. "Law isn't as clean as medicine." Lena thought about that. "Medicine isn't clean either." "No, I suppose not." The elevator opened on the first floor. They stepped out into the lobby, and the mid-morning movement of people who had no idea what had happened on the 4th floor or in a trauma bay 3 nights ago. A woman with a child. An elderly man with a walker moving toward the pharmacy window. A pair of residents crossing toward the east wing with coffee cups, and the specific exhaustion of people 36 hours into a shift. She stopped. One of the residents looked up as he passed. Young, maybe 28, with the lanyard and the slight too pale quality of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. He glanced at her without recognition. He didn't know who she was. Why would he? She watched him go. This was what the work actually looked like, not the conference rooms. Not the legal pads and the federal warrants and the chief of medicine standing up when she entered the room. It was the residents with their coffee cups, the nurse checking on the patient in Bay 3 who'd asked for water and been forgotten. The 2 a.m. call that came in 4 minutes before the next one. The decision that happened in 30 seconds with incomplete information while someone with a title told you to stand down. She'd done that work for 3 years at this hospital. She'd done a different version of it in conditions she didn't talk about before that. She wasn't sure yet what she was going to say to Alcott when the conversation he'd asked for actually happened. She wasn't sure she was ready for it. But standing in the lobby watching a sleep-deprived resident disappear around a corner, she felt something that wasn't pride exactly. More like the specific weight of knowing that the decision to act, the one she'd made at 12:24 a.m. with Holt's refusal still in the air, had been the right one, and that the rightness of it didn't come from the outcome. It had been right before she knew the outcome. It had been right when she thought it was going to cost her everything. That was the part she would have had trouble explaining to a review board. Marta was watching her. "You okay?" "Yeah," she said, and meant it, with the specific qualification that okay covered a lot of ground. They walked out. By noon, Pete Garland had heard through the floor channels what had happened in Alcott's office, the way information moved through a hospital, not officially, not in a memo, but in the specific speed of an institution processing a development that affected people who worked there. He texted her, "It's all over the floor. You're back." She texted back, "Not yet. Soon." Kara called that afternoon. Her voice was steadier than Lena expected. She'd given her statement to Marta's office that morning, she said. Everything she'd seen in the trauma bay, the sequence of it, Holt's response when the monitors crashed. She'd asked Marta whether it would affect her job, and Marta had told her carefully that her cooperation with a federal investigation was protected under specific statutes. And Kara had said, okay, in the tone of someone who was still scared but had made a decision they were going to stand behind. "I should have said something in the room," Kara said. That night, Lena thought about how to answer that honestly. "You weren't wrong not to. He had the authority, and you had 8 months in that hospital. That's a real calculation. You did it anyway. I had different information." She paused. "And I'd been in situations before where the cost of not acting was something I knew the shape of. That's not a credit to me. It's just context. What situations? She considered it for a moment. Before nursing, she said, a different job. Kara didn't push it. She said she'd follow whatever the attorney recommended going forward, and Lena told her she'd done the right thing and meant it, and the call ended. Well, Dominic came forward the following morning. He called Marta's office at 8:40, which Marta relayed to Lena with a text that said only, third witness. He gave a recorded statement describing the trauma bay from his position by the wall, the sequence of events, Holt's response to Lena's first assessment, the moment the monitors crashed, the specific period of stillness in which the surgeon had frozen. He described it plainly, without embellishment. He was factual and scared, and he gave the statement anyway. Marta called Lena afterward. 3 witness statements, all consistent, all corroborating the telemetry. A pause. Graves is building a case that's going to be very hard to argue against. When does it go public? The federal charges were sealed initially to allow the investigation to develop. Graves told me this morning they'll be unsealed at a press conference Friday afternoon. 3 days. Lena absorbed that. And Holt? He retained private counsel yesterday evening. His attorney has apparently made preliminary contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office about cooperation. Marta's voice was measured, which suggests his attorney looked at the evidence and told him what I would tell someone in his position. The documentation is too specific and too corroborated to fight. She sat with that for a moment. The image of Holt in consultation with a lawyer, the specific arithmetic of a man weighing how much of his own conduct to acknowledge in exchange for whatever reduction in exposure he could negotiate, landed differently than she'd expected. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Something more complicated than either, the specific exhaustion of realizing that the system, when it finally moved in the right direction, moved in the same grinding institutional way it moved in every direction. Slowly, procedurally, with lawyers on both sides. She'd wanted faster. She'd wanted something cleaner. She knew that wasn't how it worked, but she'd wanted it anyway. That was the human part. One more thing, Marta said. Alcott's office reached out this morning. The hospital is offering a formal public acknowledgement, not just the internal letter to the board, but an institutional statement about what happened, the role of the falsified documentation in the suspension, and the rescission. A pause. They want your input on the language. Why? Because their legal counsel told them that a public acknowledgement that accurately describes what occurred is significantly better institutional positioning than letting the federal press conference be the first public account. Marta let that land. It's self-interested, but it also means your name gets cleared publicly before Friday. Lena looked at the topographic map on her wall, the mountain range she'd hiked 2 summers ago. She'd gone alone, which some people found strange, and she'd found it straightforward. You planned your route, you moved through difficult terrain, you made decisions in real time when the terrain didn't match the map, and at the end you either reached the elevation you were trying to reach, or you turned back for a reason you could account for. She'd reached it. Both times she'd tried. Tell them I want 3 things in the statement, she said. The original notes on record is submitted. The timeline of the record's alteration on record by date and time. And the language about the charges against me should be complete, not soften, not vague. What was filed, what was withdrawn, and why. Marta was quiet for a moment. They may push back on the alteration timeline. I know. Tell them anyway. Okay. A pause. That's 3 things that make them look worse in the short term. There are also 3 things that are true. A longer pause. Then Marta said, I'll tell them that... The statement went out Thursday morning. Harlow General Hospital's official communications channel, local news outlets received it at 8 a.m., followed by a press release that the communications director had apparently spent considerable effort on. It named the charges against Lena, named them as withdrawn, cited the federal evidence hold on the original nursing documentation, and described the internal records access as a serious breach of clinical documentation integrity, currently under federal investigation. It did not name Holt by name. He was referred to as the attending physician of record, but the construction was specific enough that his name was findable within 40 minutes of the release going out, between the federal warrant that had become public record and a reporter at the Denton Falls Register who had, it turned out, been working a tip from a source she'd received earlier in the week. The tip, Lena later learned, had come from the colleague Dominic had mentioned it to at lunch on Tuesday. These were the ways things moved. Not through formal channels, not through the machinery she'd been navigating for 3 days. Through a tech who'd mentioned something to a friend, who'd mentioned it to a reporter, who'd been building a story the entire time Lena was sitting in conference rooms. The Register's piece ran Thursday afternoon, an hour after Harlow General's statement. It was detailed, specifically sourced, and included a timeline of the events in Trauma Bay 1 that matched the telemetry record precisely. The reporter, a woman named Solis, no relation, who'd been covering the health beat for 4 years, had obtained a copy of the original nursing notes comparison through a source she didn't name. The piece named the prior hospitals. It named the civil settlement from 4 years ago in enough detail to make the non-disclosure agreement essentially irrelevant. It named the patient from the first case, a man named Frank Alderman, 47, who had died 6 years ago after a post-surgical complication that a subsequent review had attributed to documentation error. Frank Alderman. She read the name twice. The story used the word fabricated in connection with Holt's clinical narrative and attributed it specifically to the telemetry discrepancy. It quoted an anonymous source described as a federal official familiar with the investigation who confirmed the records alteration and the 3-witness corroboration. It described the suspension and its circumstances in language that was accurate, specific, and didn't editorialize because it didn't need to. By 6 p.m. Thursday, the story had been picked up by 2 wire services and a regional news network. By 8 p.m., Harlow General's main line was receiving enough media inquiries that the communications director sent an all-staff memo instructing personnel to direct press calls through the official channel. Lena read the Register piece on her phone at her kitchen table. She read it the way she read her clinical notes, carefully, checking each statement against what she knew to be true. It held up. The reporter had been thorough. She set the phone down. She thought about Frank Alderman, 47 years old, a post-surgical complication that a review had called a documentation error, a family who had probably accepted that explanation because what else do you do when the institution tells you the system failed and the system has already moved on? They were going to find out this week what had actually happened. She didn't know if that was better. She suspected it was, and she suspected it was also going to be very hard. Both things were true at once. Her phone buzzed, a text from a number she now recognized, the same line that had connected her to Ruiz, which meant it connected somewhere higher than Ruiz. It said, "Press conference tomorrow. You should be there." She stared at the message. She hadn't been invited to a press conference. She hadn't been mentioned as attending. This wasn't an official notification. There was nothing official about the number or the message. It was a suggestion from a person who thought she should be in a particular room at a particular time. She started to type back, "Why?" She stopped before sending it, thought about it. Then she typed, "What time?" The response came in under 10 seconds, 10 a.m. Federal Building on Marsh Street, 3rd floor. She set the phone down. The Federal Building on Marsh Street, the U.S. Attorney's press conference unsealing the charges. She hadn't been notified as a witness. She wasn't testifying. She wasn't part of the formal proceedings. Her role in the case was as the subject of the suspension that had triggered the federal review. She had no official place in that room, but someone wanted her there. She thought about Garrett Solis in room 214 with the specific gravity of a person who understood what it cost to do the right thing and had decided, from a hospital bed, that this one wasn't going to go uncorrected. She looked at the press conference notification one more time. 10 a.m. 3rd floor. Then her phone rang. Not a text, a call. Marta, which meant it was something that needed to be said rather than written. She answered it. Marta said, "I just heard from Graves' office. They're adding a 4th charge to the federal filing." Lena waited. Holt met with his attorney yesterday and apparently made some kind of preliminary disclosure about Tuesday night that he thought would help him negotiate. He told his attorney that the decision to investigate the abdomen was his own, that it was part of his clinical assessment, not initiated by you. A pause. The problem is, Graves recorded the intake. The attorney call was privileged, but the preliminary statement Holt made directly to a federal investigator on Wednesday, the one he made before he'd retained counsel, when he thought he was still managing the situation, that recording exists. She felt the specific tightening of understanding something before it was finished. In that statement, Marta continued, Holt said, and I'm reading directly from what Graves shared with me, I authorized the nurse to confirm my suspicion about the abdomen, and she exceeded the scope of what I instructed. She waited for the rest of it. That statement is directly contradicted by the telemetry, by 3 witness statements, and by his own revised clinical narrative, which describes the decision as his own intraoperative assessment with no mention of instructing the nurse at all. Marta paused. He told 2 different stories in writing and 1 on recording, and none of the 3 versions match each other or the physical evidence. Lena sat very still. The 4th charge, Marta said, is making a false statement to a federal investigator. The kitchen was quiet. Outside her window, the city was moving toward evening with no particular awareness of any of this. Marta, she said, how bad is it for him? He has retained very expensive private counsel who will work very hard to manage it. A pause that meant but. 3 felony counts and now a 4th. A documented pattern across 6 years. A prior patient fatality that the state medical examiner is now reviewing. Her attorney's voice was careful and honest. His counsel will try to negotiate. Whether there's anything left to negotiate with, given the totality of the record, she stopped. I don't know. But the press conference tomorrow unseals all of it, every count, every prior case, in a room with reporters. Lena looked at the topographic map again. I'll be there at 10, she said. The press conference? Yes. A pause. Lena, you're not a named party in the federal proceeding. You don't have to. I know. She kept her voice level. I want to be in the room. Marta was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, it was in the tone of an attorney who had accepted her client's decision and was already adjusting. Then I'll be there with you. Thank you. She ended the call. She sat for a long moment in the kitchen, where the coffee was cold again, and the legal pad with her 14 pages of notes was still on the corner of the table, slightly displaced from where she'd left it 3 days ago. When all of this was still something she was trying to survive, rather than something moving toward a conclusion she hadn't been able to see from inside it. She pulled the legal pad toward her, looked at her own handwriting, the careful, sequential documentation of what she'd seen and said and done, written in the kitchen at 7:30 in the morning while the city was waking up, and she was trying to hold on to the truth of what had happened before someone else got to define it. She turned to a blank page. She didn't write anything. She just looked at it. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., in a room on the 3rd floor of the federal building on Marsh Street, a U.S. attorney was going to stand at a microphone and unseal the charges against Marcus Holt. All of them. Every count, every prior case. The name Frank Alderman spoken into a room with reporters. The record of 6 years of a man who had moved through institutions that protected him from the consequences of what he was. She was going to be in that room. She didn't know yet what it would feel like to sit in it. She wasn't going to try to predict. She closed the legal pad. Her phone buzzed one more time. A text, this one from Pete. Dominic wants to know if you're coming back tonight. She read it twice. She started to type yes, and then stopped. Because something had shifted in the past 3 days, in the specific, irreversible way that things shifted when you'd been through a room that changed the shape of what came after it. She didn't know yet what the shift meant in practical terms. She knew it was real. She set the phone down without answering. She'd answer Pete tomorrow, after 10 a.m., after she'd sat in the room where the truth was going to be said out loud, in public, in the specific institutional language of federal charges that meant it was going into a record that nobody could access and revise at 7:41 in the morning. She got up, washed the coffee cup, turned off the kitchen light. Outside, the city was dark now, and moving through its night the way cities did. Ambulances, the specific distant sound of the highway, a dog somewhere on the block below her window, all of it continuing. She went to bed. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. And 30 blocks away, in the federal building on Marsh Street, in an office on the 3rd floor where the lights were still on at 11 p.m., an assistant U.S. attorney named Graves was reviewing the final version of the unsealing documents and making one last note in the margin of the 4th count, the false statement charge, where the recorded evidence and the telemetry and the 3 witness accounts and the 2 prior cases and the falsified notes and the revised narrative and everything else converged into something that was, in the specific technical language of criminal prosecution, airtight. He capped his pen, looked at the stack of documents, thought about Frank Alderman, 47 years old, reached for his coffee. The coffee Graves had reached for was cold by the time he finished the documents. That was the last quiet thing about the next 16 hours. Lena arrived at the federal building on Marsh Street at 9:47. Marta was already outside, standing near the entrance with 2 coffees and the expression of a person who had slept 4 hours and intended to function on professionalism alone. She handed one of the cups to Lena without comment. The building's 3rd floor was already full when they arrived. Reporters, cameras, 2 local news crews setting up along the back wall. A row of seats had been arranged facing a podium bearing the seal of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the district. Graves was visible through the glass partition of a side office, reviewing something with 2 colleagues, jacket on, the specific focused stillness of someone about to do a thing they'd been building toward for days. Lena and Marta took seats near the side wall, not at the front. Lena hadn't come here to be seen. She'd come because the man from room 214 had told her to, and because she understood, in the way she understood most things that mattered, that some events needed a witness who had actually been there. At 10:03, Graves walked to the podium. He didn't lead with context or with history. He led with the charges. He read them in sequence, each count with its corresponding statute, his voice level and specific, in the way of someone who understood that the language was the record and the record was what persisted after the room cleared. Falsification of federal medical records, obstruction of a federal investigation, making a false statement to a federal investigator. And then, the count that required the most careful language, criminal conduct in connection with prior incidents at 2 previous medical institutions, including conduct that contributed to the death of a patient identified as Frank Alderman, 47, 6 years prior. The room was quiet when Graves said Frank Alderman's name. Not the performed quiet of people being respectful. The actual quiet of a room full of people processing that a name they hadn't known yesterday had been inside a story they were only now understanding the full shape of. Lena looked at her hands. She'd never met Frank Alderman. She didn't know his face, didn't know his family, didn't know anything about the 47 years he'd lived before he ended up in a post-surgical recovery room in a different hospital, in a different state 6 years ago. She knew only what the document said, that he'd deteriorated in a way that should have been caught, that the notes on his case had been inconsistent with the monitor records, and that a review had called it a documentation error because the review had not been pushed far enough to find what was underneath it. The system had processed his death and moved on. Marcus Holt had moved on with it. For 6 years. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed through it. Graves continued. He described the evidence, the telemetry from Trauma Bay 1, the original nursing notes versus the altered version, the 3 witness statements, the recorded pre-counsel statement in which Holt had told a federal investigator a version of events that contradicted his own written narrative. He described the records access at 7:41 a.m., the physician administrator who had used their credentials to make the alterations, and the fact that that individual had, the previous afternoon, entered into a cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office. That detail landed in the room with specific weight. The person who'd made the changes had flipped. Whatever Holt had believed about the loyalty of institutional relationships under legal pressure, he'd been wrong about that one too. Graves did not editorialize. He didn't need to. The architecture of the evidence, presented in sequence, made its own argument. When he finished, a reporter near the front raised a hand immediately. "Can you confirm whether Dr. Holt has entered into plea negotiations?" "I can confirm that his counsel has been in contact with this office. I can't characterize the nature of those communications." Another hand. "The patient from 6 years ago, Frank Alderman, has his family been notified of the federal filing?" "The family was contacted yesterday afternoon, yes." Lena closed her eyes briefly. Someone had sat down with Frank Alderman's family yesterday and told them what had actually happened. She didn't know who had made that call, what words they'd used, how the family had responded. She could imagine the shape of it, the specific delayed rupture of learning that the explanation you'd accepted, that had maybe allowed you to grieve and move forward, wasn't the true one. She hoped there was someone good in that conversation. She hoped the person who made that call had understood what they were delivering. She opened her eyes. The press conference ended at 10:51. The room went immediately to the specific contained chaos of reporters filing and cameras being broken down and the particular energy of a story that had found its complete shape and was now being transmitted outward. She and Marta moved toward the exit, and she was almost to the door when she heard her name. Not loud, just her name, from somewhere to her left, said in the specific way that meant the person saying it knew her and was not performing the knowing of her. She turned. Garrett Solis was standing 15 feet away, which meant he'd been discharged from Harlow General sometime in the past 12 hours, or had discharged himself against medical advice, which she considered equally plausible. He was in civilian clothes, standing without visible support, which told her the pain was real and being managed by will rather than absent. Beside him stood General Talco, and behind Talco, Ruiz, and a woman Lena didn't recognize who had the same quality of stillness the others carried. Solis looked like a man who had pushed himself to be here, not as a performance, but because he'd made a decision about what this moment required and had shown up accordingly, cost and all. She walked toward him. He didn't extend his hand. He looked at her directly, the same way he had in room 214, and he said, "You should have been told this sooner. What you did in that trauma bay, the clinical judgment, the decision to act when someone with authority told you not to. I've worked with people who have that. I haven't always worked with people who have it in civilian clothes, on a night shift with no one backing them up." She held his gaze. "I did my job." "You did more than your job. And then you took the consequence for it without falling apart." He paused. "I've seen people trained for that response fail it under less pressure." She didn't know what to do with that exactly. She wasn't looking for the validation. She'd stopped needing it to feel secure in what she'd done sometime around Wednesday afternoon. But there was something in hearing it said plainly by a person who understood the specific mechanics of what she'd faced, not the emotional version of it, but the actual operational version, that landed differently than she expected. "Frank Alderman," she said. "Did you know about him before Tuesday night?" Solis shook his head. "No. That came out of the investigation your case opened." He was quiet for a moment. "It should have been found 6 years ago. I don't have a clean answer for why it wasn't. The system failed him and kept moving." "Yes," she said. "It did. And then it failed the person who caught the next one." He held her gaze. "That part is on the record now, in a way that can't be revised." She nodded once. Talco stepped forward. "Ms. Vasquez, the Army doesn't have a formal mechanism for acknowledging what you did Tuesday night. You're a civilian, it's a civilian hospital. The chain of authority runs through the federal investigation rather than through us. But I want to say, directly and on record, that the conduct you demonstrated is consistent with the standard we ask of the people we deploy into the hardest situations." He paused. "You held that standard without the institutional support that makes it easier to hold. That matters." She looked at him. "I'm a nurse." "Yes," Talco said. "That's the point." She got back to her apartment at 12:30. She made food, actual food, not toast, the first real meal she'd cooked since Tuesday, and ate it standing at the counter because the table still had the legal pad on it, and she didn't want to move it yet. Her phone had been generating notifications steadily since the press conference ended. She'd silenced it in the elevator and hadn't unsilenced it. She knew what was in there, messages from Pete, from Kara, from 3 people she'd worked with over the years who'd seen the register piece or the press conference coverage. A voicemail from her mother in a different city who'd heard something secondhand and whose message would be equal parts pride and worry in the specific proportion her mother had always maintained. She'd listened to them. Not right now. Right now she stood at the counter and ate her food and looked at the topographic map and thought about what came next. Alcott had asked for a conversation about the trauma protocol review. She'd said she'd think about it. She'd been thinking about it for 3 days, in the background of everything else. The way you thought about things that required a decision you weren't ready to make from inside a crisis. She was out of the crisis now, or the acute phase of it, the part that required constant forward movement just to stay functional. What she was left with was a job that was hers again, a record that was clear, and the specific question of what to do with the fact that she'd been right, not just on Tuesday night, but about the broader thing. About what happened in that bay at 2 a.m. when the title said one thing and the monitor said another. about the gap between institutional authority and clinical reality that a protocol review could maybe narrow, if the person in the room for those conversations understood both sides of it from the inside. She wasn't sure she was that person. She was sure she was closer to it than most people Alcott could put in that room. She finished eating, washed the plate, picked up her phone. She called Pete first. He answered before the first ring finished. "Tell me everything." "I will," she said. "But first, is Dominic okay?" A pause that meant he hadn't expected that to be the first thing. "Yeah, he's rattled, but okay. Why?" "Because he was scared, and he did it anyway." "That's not a small thing. Make sure someone tells him that." "I'll tell him." She could hear Pete recalibrating. The press conference was what it needed to be. She leaned against the counter. "Pete, I'm coming back." "Tonight's?" She thought about Alcott's office, the conversation she needed to have, the protocol review, the specific gap it was meant to address, the sleep-deprived resident she'd watched cross the lobby. The 2 a.m. call that nobody prepared you for in any training room because you couldn't prepare for it. You could only do it enough times that you understood what it asked of you. "I don't know exactly what it looks like yet," she said. "But yes, I'm coming back." She called Alcott's office that afternoon and scheduled the conversation for the following week. The administrator who answered the phone confirmed it with a formality that suggested instructions had been given to accommodate the request promptly, which was its own small data point about how the hospital's position had shifted. She spent the weekend doing ordinary things. She ran 6 miles on Saturday morning through the park on the east side, which had the kind of flat industrial terrain that made pacekeeping easy. And she pushed herself harder than she usually did, not to prove anything, but because her body had been holding the week's tension in the particular way it did when she hadn't moved enough. And movement was one of the tools she had for processing things that didn't resolve through thinking. She called her mother on Sunday. The call lasted 40 minutes. Her mother cried twice, which Lena had anticipated. She asked questions that her mother had always asked. But were you safe? Were you actually safe? And Lena answered them honestly, which meant yes, eventually, after a few days that were not particularly safe. But the shape of what had happened was moving toward something that held. Her mother said, "I never understood why you went back to nursing after the army. I thought you were hiding." Lena was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't hiding, I was just doing the same work in a different place." "But you never told anyone about before." "No." "Why?" She looked at the topographic map. She'd been looking at it a lot this week. "Because it wasn't relevant until it was," she said. "And when it was relevant, it showed up anyway." Her mother didn't have an answer for that. Neither did Lena, exactly. It was just the truest way she could articulate something she'd understood in the stairwell of Harlow General, with General Talco holding the door. That the things you carried from one version of your life into the next didn't disappear because you changed the context. They became the specific shape of how you moved through the new context, how you assessed, how you held still when the room was telling you to defer, how you placed a clamp in the dark with someone else's diagnosis in the air around you and your hands telling a different story. You didn't shed who you'd been. You brought it with you, whether you named it or not. Marcus Holt entered a plea agreement 3 weeks after the federal charges were unsealed. 4 counts. No trial. His attorney had negotiated the terms in 2 sessions that Graves described to Marta as shorter than I expected, which Marta translated for Lena as meaning the evidence had left very little room to negotiate toward. The terms were specific and public. Holt was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, with an additional 18 months suspended pending completion of supervised release conditions. His medical license was permanently revoked in 3 states. Not suspended, not placed on probation, revoked, the specific terminal language that meant no reinstatement process, no pathway back. The civil exposure from the Frank Alderman case resulted in a settlement with his family that was not sealed. At the family's request, the terms were public record. His name went into the federal conviction database. His professional history was amended in the state medical board records of every state in which he'd held a license. The revised clinical narrative he'd submitted to the chief of medicine, the one he'd spent the morning after Tuesday night carefully constructing, was formally designated as a falsified document and entered into evidence. It was not clean. Accountability never was. Frank Alderman was still dead. The family had received a settlement and a public acknowledgement and the knowledge of what had actually happened. And those things were real and mattered and were also not the same as the 47 years of life that had ended in a recovery room 6 years ago. Lena held that fact. She didn't put it down. She thought about it when she needed to think about why the work she did in that bay on Tuesday night had been about something larger than Tuesday night. Why it had always been about something larger, even when she was the only one in the room who understood that. You saved the person in front of you. That was the job. But the person in front of you was also part of a longer line. And the decision you made in that moment rippled backward into cases you'd never know, and forward into cases you couldn't see yet. Every call you made under pressure when the wrong person had the title, every time you held the line or failed to hold it, it mattered in ways the immediate moment couldn't contain. She understood that now more precisely than she had before. It didn't make the job lighter. It made it something she was more clear-eyed about carrying. She went back to Harlow General on a Tuesday, 4 weeks after the night in question, almost to the hour. She didn't make a thing of it. She clocked in at 11 p.m. the way she'd clocked in 1,000 times, put her bag in the locker, checked the board, found Pete at the station reviewing the handoff notes from day shift. He looked up when she came through, and his expression did something complicated that settled into something simpler, and he said, "Bay 3 is backed up. 2 admits waiting." "On it," she said. That was it. That was the welcome back. She worked the shift the way she worked every shift. Present, specific, steady in the way the night required. The first admit was a chest pain presentation that turned out to be musculoskeletal. The second, a diabetic complication that required careful management through the first 2 hours. She checked on both of them more than protocol required because that was how she worked and she didn't intend to change it. At 2:15 a.m., she was at the nurse's station writing notes when Kara came and stood beside her and didn't say anything for a moment and then said, "I'm glad you're back." Lena looked up. "Me too." "I've been thinking about something." Kara paused. "The night it happened. The way you stayed in the room even after he told you to step back. I've been thinking about what made you able to do that." Lena considered it honestly. "I knew what I was looking at, and I knew what happened when you looked at something clearly and didn't act on it." She paused. "That knowledge is heavier than what he said to me, so I used the heavier thing." Kara nodded slowly. "How do you get that? That kind of certainty?" "You don't start with certainty," Lena said. "You start with the willingness to be wrong while acting on what you know. And you build from there." She looked back at her notes. "It takes a long time, and you never get all the way there." Kara stood beside her for another moment. Then she went back to her patient. Lena finished the notes and moved to the next one. Woot. The protocol review meeting happened the following Thursday. Alcott's conference room, 8 people, 2 attending physicians, 3 nurses including Lena and Pete, a resident, and an administrator. The purpose was to examine the gap between clinical observation and decision-making authority in high-acuity situations, the specific gap that had existed in Trauma Bay 1 and that existed, Lena knew, in every emergency room operating at full capacity with a tired team and a title structure that hadn't been designed with 2 a.m. in mind. She didn't go in with an agenda. She went in with what she knew from the floor, from the night shift, from the specific experience of being the person in the room whose knowledge wasn't being counted. She asked 3 questions that changed the direction of the conversation twice and contributed to a specific framework revision that 6 months later became part of the hospital's formal triage protocol for high-acuity trauma presentations. Her name was in the acknowledgement section of the protocol document. Not first, Pete was first, which was correct because Pete had been doing this longer. But her name was there. She didn't frame it as vindication. She framed it as work. Because that was what it was. Not the end of something. The continuation of something that had been true all along, that the week in question had clarified rather than created. She'd always been this person. She'd been this person in a different uniform, in a different country, in conditions she'd never described to anyone who hadn't been there. She'd been this person on the night shift in Denton Falls, quiet and present, and waiting for the moment when what she knew would be needed. The moment had come. It had cost her exactly what it cost. And then it had held. There was a lesson in that, if you were willing to sit with the uncomfortable version of it. Not the version where doing the right thing was eventually rewarded in a way that made the cost worth it, because that framing made the reward the point, and the reward wasn't always what came. Sometimes you did the right thing, and it stayed buried. Sometimes the documentation got lost, and the review stopped short, and the name went into a record-marked documentation error, and the system moved on. The lesson wasn't that it always worked out. The lesson was that it had to be done anyway, because the alternative, the version where you stepped back and stayed quiet and let the wrong diagnosis stand because the wrong person had the title, that alternative had a cost too. It just distributed the cost differently. It put it on the person on the table and on the next person and on Frank Alderman and on every patient in every room where someone who knew something chose the easier version of standing still. She had not chosen that version, not on Tuesday night and not on any night before it that had mattered. She was not going to choose it going forward. That was all. That was the whole of it. On a Wednesday in November, 3 months after the charges against Holt were unsealed, Lena Vasquez clocked into the night shift at Harlow General, put her badge on, and walked through the trauma bay on her way to the nurses' station. She ran her eyes over the equipment, checked the supply cart by habit, noted the positions of the staff on the floor, assessed the board. 2 admits waiting, 1 critical. She moved toward the critical bay. Behind her, the ambulance doors opened. She didn't look back. She knew what was there. She walked forward.